White South Africans get the red carpet as refugees while everyone else gets the shaft? Let's break that down. Hi, I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the resident legal diva, and this is The Breakdown. Make sure to hit that subscribe button to get all the latest updates from Legal AF. Yesterday, a jet arrived in Dulles Airport carrying white South Africans who now have newly minted refugee status here in the United States. What are they fleeing from, you may ask? Absolutely nothing. But to hear Apartheid Ken, otherwise known as Elon Musk, and the president tell it, they're being targeted. White people are being murdered at crazy rates in South Africa. They need our help. They need our tax dollars to help them. And so they have been given this elevated refugee status, and they were able to come here and resettle. Now, here's the backstory of all of this. As with everything coming out of this administration, it's based on flat out lies. So, as you know, South Africa has a history of apartheid. And this was a very brutal system where white people, much like what we know of slavery in the United States, white people basically control the country. We're a minority of the population, but they control the entire country, not allowing Black people to, and we're talking native Black South Africans, right? Like this is their land, but they were not allowed to own property. They weren't allowed to work, or there was a lot of restrictions as to where they could work. They couldn't, be out in certain areas, just all the worst things that you can think of Jim Crow. Multiply that by 10, and that was apartheid. Now, apartheid was abolished in the early 90s. Nelson Mandela was the first democratically elected prime minister from all the population, not just white people, but actually white and Black South Africans were able to actually vote for him, and he became the first president. But that in and of itself did not undo the legacy of apartheid. So how it stands now is that white people in South Africa are 7% of the population, but they owned 3/4 of the land in South Africa. So riddle me how they are somehow being targeted and all of that. Now, there's a narrative going around that they have been targeted for murder, as in homicide, robbery, all of that. There's a little bit more to it than that. So sadly, South Africa does struggle with a lot of violence. The homicide rate is around 75 people per day. But that's usually not white people. That's usually Black people. So what we've seen is about 300 farms owned by white South Africans that have been targeted in recent years. But again, when you look at the total number of farms in South Africa, which is 40,000, the numbers aren't exactly that drastic, right? So of course, it's awful for anyone to get victimized. Let's be very clear about that. This is not something that we're supporting people being hurt. But looking at it in the larger scheme of things, we all know crime happens everywhere, right? And if you're looking at the percentages, if you've got 40,000 farms and only 300 survivors, or 300 of those being victimized, that is pretty consistent with what crime numbers look like around the world. I mean, it's nothing to say that they are being specifically targeted. Now, the other nuance to this is that a lot of these farms are remote. So you're in a remote area, you're wealthy, you're in a country where there's abject poverty, right? Like the unemployment rate is insane for Black South Africans as opposed to white South Africans. So when you're looking at the fact that white people have a much lower unemployment rate than Black people in South Africa, now you have a situation where there's poverty and there's needs, and folks are going to victimize whoever they can, especially if they think that they can get money or something along those lines, right? So if you're in a remote location, you're wealthy, unfortunately, that does make you a target. Now, is law enforcement working with them, all of that? Yes. Do they have the ability also to defend themselves through gun laws and all of that? Yes. Is it okay? No, of course not. But does it merit them having special refugee status in the United States when people fleeing from actual communist countries like Venezuela don't get that kind of protection? Or Haiti, which is completely falling apart and literally run by gangs, and people are literally being murdered on a day-to-day basis in front of their kids, but they don't get special refugee status? Food for thought as to what their intentions are there. So this is all very much part and parcel of a much broader racial and racist push that you're seeing from this administration. So again, these South Africans now get this special dispensation because their buddy Apartheid Ken was advocating for them, and again standing on these right-wing lies that they're being targeted and all of that. One last bit about that before I get into the broader picture as it comes to the presidential administration. One of the rallying cries used by the right wing and Apartheid Ken around this whole situation is that white land is being taken away by the black government. Basically, that the black government is throwing white people off of their land, allowing them to be victimized, and all of this. Now, a bill was passed in South Africa called the Expropriation Act, which allows the government to basically take land, sometimes with compensation, sometimes without, from residents and owners in South Africa for governmental purposes. Now, this was really talked about in the sphere of kind of reconciliation because of the fact that, again, the reason why these landowners have this land is not because they went out and bought it. This was a legacy from apartheid. Remember, they are descendants of the white ruling majority that basically stole all the land from the native black South Africans and kept it for themselves. So the government has been trying to figure out ways to be able to have this reconciliation where this land can now be given to other people who, again, it's not their fault they got locked out from being able to have land and have generational wealth and everything else. But the devil, of course, was in the details because they didn't want to just throw people off their land and then give it to somebody else just like that. So they're trying to be sensitive about it. Now, in my opinion, the time is a little late for that because this should have happened back in 1994 when apartheid ended. Now that we're looking 30 some years later, the urgency is a little different and people feel some type of way now, right? Because they're like, oh, I got to keep my land for 30 years. What do you mean that I have to give it up now? So there's that. But also to be clear on what the Expropriation Act does, it's much like what we have in the US called eminent domain. The government can come take your property if they need to. Let's not get that twisted. It happens all the time. They usually should give you, maybe not market value, but at least the appraised value of your house. But if they need to build a new highway or whatever the case may be, if there's a governmental need, they can come in and displace whole communities. We see that all the time when it comes to gentrification. Happens a lot in this country, right? So there's that aspect. So the act that was passed in South Africa is much like that. So any narrative that white people are being thrown off their land on a daily basis, that's not actually happening. It's a long process. There's basically a court process you have to go through. The government has to show some sort of need to be able to take that land. Again, it's not this willy-nilly displacement that Apartheid Ken and others are trying to let people believe. Ironically, white South Africans have even spoken out to be like, hey, yeah, I'm a white South African, and yeah, no thank you. I don't need refugee status. I'm good. Clearly, Mr. President and Elon Musk, you don't understand what's currently going on in South Africa and, the political, wranglings that are going on. We don't feel, like we're being targeted and we feel safe. We're fine. Which is also kind of evidence in the fact that only 50 people got on that plane to come to the U.S. to get refugee status from South Africa. So there's that. But going back to this broader pattern that we're seeing in this country, the fact that this administration is using our tax dollars to reward and protect people who have historically marginalized a whole country is pretty telling. On top of that, in recent weeks, this administration actually signed another order, yet another one, that removes the desegregation requirement in a rural parish in Louisiana. Basically saying that we don't need to monitor these schools, the school district anymore. They got their act together. Segregation is a thing of the past. And, basically everything is cool now, right? And we know that a lot of places don't exactly have it together, especially in some of these rural communities where, again, you've got this historic disenfranchisement, you have power residing in a small amount of people while, especially Black and brown populations are marginalized in terms of even, let's say, having access to voting places, having access to schools, having adequate access in said schools, like actually schools with computers and stuff, right? As opposed to other communities and getting well-resourced, better resourced than other communities. So historically, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division would be keeping an eye on these school districts to make sure that segregation isn't occurring, that students are being treated equally, that they're getting equal access to education, all of that. And this Department of Justice has made it very clear they don't view that as their mandate. So they have sent the message in that order basically saying we should be revisiting all of the desegregation orders when it comes to schools. So segregation is still illegal in this country, let's be clear. But this administration is sending a message by cozying up to white South Africans who are very upset that there might be some form of equality in the country, despite them benefiting from apartheid and a very brutal regime. And now you see, okay, segregation really isn't a thing. Let's rewrite history and pretend that all of the things that happened from the Civil Rights Movement on just never happened, Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act, all of that. Let's put all that to the side and basically turn a blind eye if people in power decide to discriminate. And we're not going to hold them accountable. And in the last bit that really shows where this administration is at is now Pete Hegseth is back with his military foolishness where he is, again, ordering all of the armed forces to go through their libraries, go through all their commands, everything, to make sure there's no books that could be viewed as diverse. Much like I did a previous video on this about the purge that happened in the Naval Library and how they took, books that were, again, just talking about history, talking about the contributions of different races, groups of people, and all of that. They're taking that out of the library, but they're leaving books like Mein Kampf, literally Mein Kampf, in the library. So again, you're supporting and highlighting racist views, and you're trying to get rid of any counterpoint to that. You're allowing white South Africans who have participated in the marginalizing of other people to get safe harbor here. And you're also trying to end desegregation and bring back segregation. Is it just me, or are y'all seeing a pattern here? Highly disturbing. I'll be watching all of this and keeping you posted. Make sure to subscribe, and that way you can get all the up-to-date dramas that are happening on a daily basis out of this administration. I'm Melba Pearson, also known as the resident legal diva, and this was The Breakdown. Take care.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.